Greetings, everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know where and what time you're listening from. Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy our stories, leave a like and subscribe so you never miss one. Now, turn off the lights, close your eyes, and relax. The first emotion I felt in the house was pride. It was the first property I'd ever bought, a small townhouse on a quiet street with a neglected backyard that promised more work than rest. But it was mine. Every crack in the wall, every loose tile in the kitchen was a project, an opportunity. I was by nature an optimist, someone who sees solutions where others see problems. I spent the first month in a state of happy exhaustion, painting walls, fixing up the yard, feeling the house gradually soaking up my own energy, my sweat, and my hopes. The place was becoming a home, a reflection of my character. Or so I thought. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It began with small waves of irritation that made no sense. One day, while trying to hang a picture, the nail bent. Instead of my usual shrug and a second try, I felt a surge of rage so intense it surprised me. I threw the hammer to the floor with disproportionate force and felt the urge to punch the wall. I stopped, my hand in the air, panting, bewildered by my own reaction. The anger dissipated as quickly as it had come, leaving a trail of shame and confusion. This wasn't me. I had never been an angry person. I chalked it up to fatigue, to the stress of the move. But the episodes repeated. A friend called to cancel dinner, and instead of my usual understanding, I answered with a curt monosyllable and hung up on him. I watched a TV show about a family winning a prize and found myself thinking, with a cynicism that wasn't mine, that the money would probably destroy their lives. They were dark, sour thoughts that seemed to bubble up from a poisoned well inside me. And the strangest part was that this new version of myself only seemed to exist within the walls of my house. When I went out to work, when I met people outside, I was back to being my old self. My friends and colleagues noticed nothing, but as soon as I crossed the threshold of my door upon returning, I felt a layer of negativity settle over me, like a heavy, invisible coat. The house, my project of happiness, was becoming the source of a bitterness I didn't understand. I began to notice that the feeling was stronger in certain areas. The living room and kitchen were relatively neutral, but the hallway leading to the bedrooms felt oppressive. And the small back bedroom, the one I planned to use as a study, was the epicenter. Every time I entered it, a wave of pure resentment would hit me. I'd find myself staring out the window at my neighbor's perfectly manicured lawn, feeling a pang of corrosive envy. I'd see children playing in the street and be filled with a sense of annoyance, of irritation at their noisy joy. These emotions were so alien to my personality that I felt I was going crazy, as if a stranger had moved into my head. My home ceased to be a refuge. It became a place I dreaded returning to. I started working longer hours, finding any excuse to eat out, to come home late and go straight to bed, hoping sleep would be a truce. But even in sleep, I began to have nightmares filled with arguments and angry faces. The house was poisoning my soul, and I didn't know why. There were no strange noises, no objects moving on their own, no apparitions. It wasn't a haunted house in the classic sense, it was something worse. It was a sick house, and its sickness was contagious. I needed answers. My natural optimism refused to accept that I was losing my mind for no reason. There had to be a reason, an explanation tied to the house itself. One Sunday afternoon, I saw my next-door neighbor, a very old woman who was always tending her rose bushes. I mustered my courage and approached the fence separating us. I asked her about the previous owner of my house. The woman looked at me, squinting. Her kind expression tensed slightly. "Ah, yes," she said quietly. "Mr. Morales, a very lonely man." I explained that I was curious about the house's history. She hesitated as if she didn't want to talk about it, but finally she sighed and began to tell me. She said that Mr. Morales had lived in that house for almost 50 years. He had moved in as a young man with his wife. But apparently she left him just a couple of years later. No one ever knew why. And from then on, he was alone. Over the years, he soured. He became a recluse, a man consumed by resentment. He hated everything and everyone, the woman told me. He hated the sound of children, hated music, hated seeing happy couples. He'd spend all day staring out the window, with a bitterness in his face that was frightening. He never spoke to anyone except to complain. She told me he had died in the house, alone, of a heart attack. They found him several days later in the small back bedroom, the epicenter, the nest of his resentment. The story hit me with the force of a revelation. I wasn't crazy. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost walking the halls. It was impregnated. It was saturated with 50 years of one man's bitterness, rage, and loneliness. The walls, the floors, the very air, everything was contaminated by the emotional residue of a miserable life. And I, unknowingly, was absorbing that poison every day. The relief of having an explanation was immediately replaced by an even greater fear. How do you fight an emotion? How do you clean a feeling? I decided I wouldn't give up. I had put all my savings and my hopes into this house. I wasn't going to let a dead man's misery take it from me. I decided to fight back, to perform a kind of emotional exorcism. Bitterness feeds on loneliness and silence, so I decided to fill the house with the opposite. I planned a dinner party. I invited my closest friends, the most cheerful and optimistic people I knew. I wanted to fill the house with laughter, music, and happy conversations. I wanted positive energy to cleanse the emotional rot embedded in the walls. The night of the party, I forced myself to be in a good mood. I put on upbeat music, opened the windows to let the air circulate, and cooked the best meal I knew how. At first, everything went well. My friends arrived, filling the house with their chatter and laughter. The atmosphere was warm and festive. We sat down to dinner, told stories, made toasts. For a moment, I felt my plan was working. The house felt light, normal. But then, halfway through dinner, something began to change. A trivial conversation about politics turned into a heated argument between two friends who usually agreed on everything. Another friend made a sarcastic comment about his partner's new job, a comment with a venomous tip that silenced the table. I began to feel the atmosphere curdle, the negativity I knew so well seeping into the air like a colorless gas. The tension became unbearable. Small squabbles, old resentments I never knew existed between my friends began to surface. The conversation became forced, filled with awkward silences and hostile glances. The party died. People started making excuses and leaving much earlier than planned, leaving behind a feeling of unease and fractured friendships. I was left alone in the living room, surrounded by the remnants of dinner, half-drunk glasses, and silence. My attempt at an exorcism had been a catastrophic failure. Not only had I failed to cleanse the house, but I had used my friends as catalysts, spreading its poison to them. And then, in the thick, heavy silence, I heard it. It was the first anomalous sound I'd ever heard in that house. It wasn't a laugh, not a cry, not a whisper. It was a choked chuckle, low and full of contempt, a guttural sound filled with a malevolent satisfaction. It was coming from the direction of the hallway, from the small back bedroom. I froze. The emotional residue wasn't passive. It wasn't just a stain on the wall. It was conscious, and it was laughing at me. The muffled laugh I heard from the back bedroom changed everything. Until that moment, I had been the passive victim of an influence, a kind of emotional contamination. But the sound of that laugh was a declaration. It was proof that I wasn't facing a simple residue, a psychic stain on the walls. I was facing a consciousness, an old, lonely consciousness, filled with a resentment that had outlived its host's death. The failure of the dinner party taught me a terrible lesson. My optimism, my joy wasn't an antidote. It was fuel. The presence didn't weaken with happiness. It fed on it, twisted it, and converted it into its opposite. My friends' joy had turned to envy, their jokes to sarcasm, their affection to resentment. The house was a prism that broke down any light entering it into the darkest shadows. My strategy changed. I no longer tried to fill the house with life. Now I tried to survive in it. The place began to decay physically, as if my own despair was accelerating its entropy. The plants I had bought with such excitement withered in a matter of days, their leaves turning brown and brittle even though I watered them. Milk would spoil in the refrigerator hours after I bought it. The mirrors in the bathroom and bedroom fogged up constantly with a greasy film that was impossible to wipe completely clean, and a sour smell, like rusted metal, began to permeate the air, especially in the hallway. The entire house seemed to be physically manifesting the rot it held within. I no longer felt irritated or angry. Now the predominant feeling was a gray apathy, a sense of defeat that crushed my chest and made every task, no matter how small, seem like a monumental effort. The invasion crept into my last refuge, my dreams. I began to have nightmares that didn't belong to me. They weren't dreams of monsters or of falling. They were dreams of unfathomable sadness and bitterness. I dreamed I was an old man, sitting in a chair in the back bedroom, staring out the window for hours as the sun set. I felt the ache in my joints, the loneliness like a heavy blanket. In another dream, I relived a terrible argument with a woman I didn't know, but whose hurtful words I felt as if they were aimed at me. "You'll end up alone," she screamed at me in the dream. "Your bitterness is a poison that drives everyone away." One night I dreamed it was Christmas. I saw the neighbors' families through the window, their houses full of light and people, and I felt a wave of hatred so pure and intense that I woke up with the taste of bile in my throat. I would wake from these nightmares not with fear, but with the residue of those alien emotions. I would wake up feeling Mr. Morales' loneliness, his resentment, his self-pity. His life was becoming my memory. The consciousness in the house also became more direct. It dropped the subtlety of emotional influence and began to communicate. They were whispers, but they didn't come from the air. They sounded directly in my head like an intrusive thought whenever I entered the back bedroom. They were single words, laced with venom. Alone. Failure. Nobody. Useless. They were the pillars of the philosophy of the man who had died there, and now he was trying to make them mine. The optimism that had defined my whole life was crumbling under the constant siege. I'd look in the mirror and see a stranger, a man with my face but with a cynical, tired gaze. I was losing the battle. The house wasn't going to kill me physically. It was killing my soul, replacing it with a darker one. I knew I had two options: run or fight. Running meant losing everything, the house, my savings, and living with the certainty that I had let this thing win, let it stay there, waiting for its next victim. Fighting seemed impossible. How do you fight a feeling? I couldn't punch it, I couldn't burn it. My attempt to fight it with happiness had been a disaster. Happiness was a complex emotion, with shades of longing and sometimes envy, and the house knew exactly how to use those cracks to corrupt it. So what was left? If I couldn't use light, did I have to use darkness? No, that would be surrender, becoming Mr. Morales. I thought and thought, sitting in the only place that felt relatively safe, the back garden steps. And then, I understood. The entity fed on emotion, on any strong emotion. My initial anger, my later optimism, the discomfort and resentment of my friends. It was all energy for it. It fed on the drama of the human soul. Therefore, the only way to starve it was to give it nothing. The true opposite of bitterness and hatred wasn't happiness. It was the void, indifference, absolute apathy. I had to become an emotional desert. It was a terrible plan, a form of psychological self-mutilation, but it was the only one I had. My counterattack began that same night. I didn't avoid the back bedroom. On the contrary, I carried a mattress in and put it on the floor, in the very center. This was going to be my battlefield. I sat on the mattress and closed my eyes. I didn't pray. I didn't meditate in the traditional sense. I simply focused on emptying myself, on feeling nothing. The house's response was immediate and violent. A wave of pure rage hit me, so strong it almost made me scream. The image of everyone who had ever wronged me flashed through my mind. I felt the urge to break something, but I didn't. I observed the rage as if it were a cloud in the sky, acknowledged it, and let it pass. Then came the sadness, the memory of every loss, every disappointment. Tears burned my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I observed the pain, felt it, and let it go. I spent days in that room. The entity threw its entire arsenal at me. It bombarded me with Mr. Morales's memories, with his loneliness, his hatred. I felt his pain over the wife who left him, his envy of others' happiness. It whispered its venomous words in my head. Failure. Alone. No one loves you. But I refused to react. I became a blank wall. I didn't fight the feelings. I simply refused to make them mine. Hunger and thirst became real, but I ignored the physical pain just as I ignored the emotional. It was a brutal discipline. My body grew weak, but I felt my mind become strangely clear, hard as steel. And slowly, I began to notice a change. The waves of emotion were growing weaker, more desperate. The whispers were losing their force, becoming pathetic murmurs. The house, the consciousness, was starving. On the last night, the attack was the strongest of all. I was hit by a wave of pure terror, the certainty of my own death, the vision of my body rotting in that very room. But even to terror, I refused to give a response. And then everything stopped. Silence fell on the house, but this time it was a different silence. It was an empty silence. The oppression was gone. The air felt light. The cold corner of the room was now a normal temperature. I opened my eyes. The room was just a room. The house was just a house. I had done it. I stood up, weak and shaky, but whole. The bitterness was gone. Reflective coda. Years later, I still live in the same house. It's quiet. A real, peaceful quiet. But I've learned that ghosts aren't always the souls of the dead. Sometimes they are simply the feelings that refuse to die with them. Emotions so strong they anchor themselves to a place, waiting for someone to infect. And the most powerful exorcism isn't one performed with prayers or rituals, but with the difficult, painful act of emptying oneself, of offering a desert where the poison can find no root. The notary handed me the keys with an expression that mixed pity with a vague, professional disinterest. There were 2 of them, large and made of dark iron, held together by a rusted ring. They represented my only inheritance and at the same time my only way out. The house had belonged to a great-aunt whose name I only knew from the birthday cards my mother used to make me sign as a child. I never saw her in person. Her solitary, silent death had made me the owner of a property in one of the oldest and most forgotten parts of the city, a labyrinth of narrow streets where the sun barely dared to enter. I had no other choice. Selling it would take months I couldn't afford, and my financial situation was so desperate that the idea of a roof, any roof, outweighed any misgivings. The first time I put the key in the lock, I felt a stubborn resistance. The solid wood door, its green paint peeling like the skin of a sick reptile, opened with a long, agonized groan that seemed to wake something inside. I was met by a blast of stale air, a cocktail of dust, dampness, and an underlying smell of something floral and withered, like potpourri that had been decaying for a century. The entryway was a pit of shadows. The only light came from the open door at my back, insufficient to pierce the darkness that pooled in the corners and climbed the imposing wooden staircase that dominated the space. The furniture was covered in white sheets which looked like a congregation of hunched ghosts in the dim light. I walked slowly, and the sound of my footsteps on the tile floor was absorbed by the thick silence, as if the house swallowed any noise alien to its own stillness. I pulled one of the sheets off what turned out to be a sofa, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the beam of light. The fabric underneath was worn, with a faded floral pattern. Everything in the house spoke of a stopped time, of a life that had simply gone out, leaving its empty husks behind. I spent the first few days in a feverish burst of cleaning, a desperate attempt to impose my own life over the echo of the one that had been extinguished there. I scrubbed floors, cleaned windows caked with a film of grime that distorted the outside world, and hauled out boxes full of useless objects. Yellowed newspapers, empty medicine bottles, clothes that smelled of mothballs. Yet, no matter how much I cleaned, the feeling of oppression didn't disappear. The house had a peculiar chill, a cold that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature, but seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. It clung to the skin, and there were areas, like the upstairs hallway or the stair landing, where the cold intensified into a physical presence, as if you were walking through a curtain of icy water. The noises began subtly, almost imperceptibly. At first, I attributed them to the building's age. An old house, I told myself, has a right to its own ailments. A creak on the stairs when I was in the kitchen. The moan of a pipe in the middle of the night. The faint tapping of a loose shutter that, when I went to check, I found firmly secured. They were easy to rationalize, to file away in the mental folder of old house things. But their persistence, their strange cadence began to wear away at my logic. The creak on the stairs always sounded the same, a pattern of 3 steps, always the same ones, as if someone were slowly walking halfway up and stopping. One night, while reading in the living room, I heard a different sound. It was a soft, rhythmic noise coming from upstairs, a scratch, a slow, deliberate scratch against wood. I froze, straining to hear. The sound continued for almost a minute and then stopped abruptly. I went up the stairs holding my breath, my heart hammering in my chest. I checked every room. There was nothing. No sign of mice or anything that could have caused the noise. All the doors were closed as I had left them, all except one. The door to the master bedroom, my great-aunt's room, was ajar, a sliver of darkness watching me. I was certain, absolutely certain, I had closed it that morning. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. I closed the door slowly, turned the key in the lock, and promised myself I would not enter that room again. The bedroom became the epicenter of my growing unease. Even though the door remained locked, the presence inhabiting the house seemed to be concentrated there. Often, when passing it, I felt that drop in temperature, more intense than anywhere else. Sometimes, if I pressed my ear to the wood, I thought I could hear an almost inaudible whisper, like the rustle of silk or the murmur of a held breath. I told myself it was the wind, that it was my own blood pulsing in my ears, but the doubt was a seed that had already sprouted. I decided to explore the rest of the house for answers, for something that would give me a clue about the woman who had lived and died there. In a dusty trunk in the attic, I found a hat box containing a photo album. The photos, in black and white and sepia, showed my great-aunt at different stages of her life. As a young woman, she was strikingly beautiful, with a clear, direct gaze. But as the photos approached the present, her expression changed. The serenity gave way to a palpable tension, a shadow of perpetual fear in her eyes. In the last photographs, now an old woman, she always appeared inside the house. Never in the garden, never on the street. And in all of them, her gaze was slightly averted from the lens, as if she were observing something just beside her, something just out of frame. The last photo in the album made my blood run cold. It was loose, not glued into the pages. It was a picture of the master bedroom, the one I kept locked. It showed the 4-poster bed, the wardrobe, the dresser with the oval mirror. The photo was taken from the doorway. It looked like a normal picture of an empty room until my eyes fixed on the mirror. The mirror was not reflecting the opposite wall. It was reflecting a figure. A dark, blurry silhouette of a woman standing in the center of the room. It wasn't my great-aunt. The figure was tall, thin, and seemed to be wearing a long, dark dress. Her face was an indistinguishable smudge, but I could feel, with an irrational certainty, that she was staring directly into the mirror, at the camera, at me. I dropped the album as if it were burning. This wasn't suggestion, it wasn't the wind, this was proof. There was someone else in the house, or at least the echo of someone. The reason my great-aunt never left. The reason for the fear in her eyes. She wasn't alone, and now neither was I. The phenomena became bolder. They were no longer just sounds. One afternoon, upon entering the kitchen, I found a glass of water on the center of the table, a glass I had not left there. It was filled to the brim, not a single drop spilled. Another time, the old radio in the living room, unplugged for years, began to emit static for a few seconds before falling silent again. I began to feel constantly watched. The feeling was so strong that I would sometimes spin around, expecting to catch whoever was stalking me from the shadows. There was never anyone, just the sheet-covered furniture, the dark hallways, and the expectant silence. Sleep became a luxury. I would wake up in the middle of the night soaked in sweat with the certainty that I was not alone in my room. I wouldn't open my eyes. I would lie motionless, listening, feeling. I could sense the change in the atmosphere, the weight of a gaze on me. One night, the smell of withered lavender was so intense it made me cough. It was the same scent that permeated the locked bedroom. It was coming from the foot of my bed. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, paralyzed by terror. I waited, counting my own heartbeats until the smell faded as mysteriously as it had come. I knew I couldn't go on like this. Living like a prisoner in my own house, sleeping in a small guest room while an unknown entity claimed the rest of the space, was not an option. Curiosity, a morbid and self-destructive curiosity, began to outweigh the fear. I needed to know. I needed to understand what inhabited this house, what had terrified my great-aunt to her death. And the answer, I knew, was on the other side of that locked door. One stormy night, as lightning intermittently illuminated the dusty rooms, I made a decision. The house creaked and moaned with every gust of wind, as if protesting what I was about to do. I took the old iron key to the master bedroom. It was cold as ice. I climbed the stairs, and this time the usual 3 steps didn't creak under my feet. The silence in the upstairs hallway was total, unnatural, as if the epicenter of the storm itself were contained in that corridor. I reached the door. The air around it was frigid. I could feel the vibration of the presence on the other side, an expectant energy. With a trembling hand, I inserted the key into the lock. The mechanism turned with surprising smoothness without the slightest noise. I placed my hand on the knob. It was frozen. I held my breath and opened the door. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing a darkness that seemed denser and older than in the rest of the house. The air that met me was glacial and so heavy with the scent of withered lavender it almost choked me. I took a hesitant step across the threshold. Behind me, the crash of distant thunder seemed to sever any tie to the outside world. I was inside. The door clicked shut behind me, soft and final, plunging me into a near-total blackness, broken only by the brief flashes of lightning that crept around the edges of the heavy curtain covering the window. In those fleeting moments of spectral light, the room was revealed to me in fragments just like the old photograph. There was the bed with its dark wooden canopy, the imposing wardrobe, and opposite me, the dresser on which the oval mirror rested. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but unlike the rest of the house, there were no white sheets here. Everything was exposed, as if its owner had just stepped out and would return at any moment. The silence was absolute. Not even the roar of the storm seemed to fully penetrate this sanctuary. It was a heavy, expectant stillness. I moved toward the center of the room. The wooden floor didn't creak under my feet. It was as if sound itself was afraid to manifest here. My objective was the mirror. I was drawn to it with a mixture of dread and necessity. As a new flash of lightning lit the room, I saw myself reflected, my pale face, my eyes wide with fear. There was nothing else, just my own terrified figure in a dead room. I felt a pang of disappointment, immediately followed by a wave of relief that made me tremble. Maybe it had all been a product of my imagination, a psychosis fed by loneliness and the suggestive power of this decrepit house. I approached the dresser. My fingers brushed the dusty surface. I opened one of the top drawers. It was empty. The second one, too. In the third, my fingers bumped against a small, rectangular object. I pulled it out. It was a small journal bound in dark, almost black leather. It had no lock. The leather was cold and strangely smooth, as if it hadn't collected a single mote of the dust surrounding it. I sat on the edge of the bed, which protested with a faint groan, and opened the journal. The handwriting was fine and elegant, a woman's. It was not the shaky script of my great-aunt. The first few pages were dated over 60 years ago. They spoke of arriving at the house, of the excitement and fear of starting a new life as a companion to an elderly, wealthy lady. The author's name was Elisa. She described the house with almost childlike wonder, marveling at its size and beauty, so different from the humble home she had left behind. The first entries were full of hope. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The hope faded, replaced by a growing melancholy. Elisa wrote about the loneliness. The lady of the house was severe and distant, treating her more like a prisoner than a companion. She was forbidden to receive visitors and rarely allowed to go out. Her world had shrunk to the four walls of this house. Her only window to the outside world was the one in her bedroom. This very room. She wrote about the long hours spent sitting by the window, watching people pass by on the street, imagining the lives they led so free and oblivious to her confinement. Then, the entries grew darker. Elisa began to speak of the house as if it were alive. She wrote about the whispers in the walls, about shadows that moved in the corner of her eye. She mentioned a cold that never left her, a cold that she claimed came from the mirror. Sometimes, she wrote, when I look at myself, I see someone else behind me, a shadow. I know no one is there, but I feel it. It watches me from the other side of the glass. It's waiting for me. The terror I had felt was reflected in her words, written decades ago. I wasn't crazy. It was real, and it was old. The last part of the journal was nearly illegible. The elegant script had devolved into a feverish, desperate scrawl. She talked about the shadow in the mirror, saying it was no longer content to just watch. She wrote that it whispered to her, telling her there was no escape, that the house would never let her go. The final entry consisted of a single sentence, written with a force that had nearly torn the paper. I no longer know which side of the mirror is real. There was nothing more. The rest of the pages were blank. I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Elisa, she was the presence. A trapped soul, not by death, but by despair and loneliness, imprisoned in this room and in that mirror. My great-aunt's story suddenly made sense. She wasn't terrified of a violent ghost, but of the constant company of a sorrow so deep it had become toxic, a sorrow that seeped through the walls and poisoned the air. It was then that I felt it, the cold. It was no longer an ambient sensation. It was an active presence wrapping itself around me like a shroud. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my own breath condensing in the air. The lavender scent became overwhelming, so thick it was almost a taste in the back of my throat. The journal slipped from my hands and hit the floor without a sound. I slowly raised my eyes to the mirror. I was no longer alone in the reflection. Behind my shoulder, a figure was materializing in the glass. It was blurry at first, like the smudge in the photograph, but it slowly gained definition. It was a tall, thin woman in a dark, simple dress. Her hair was pulled back in an austere bun. Her face was pale, a waxy white, and her eyes were two pits of infinite darkness. There was no anger in her expression, no malice. Only a sadness so vast and deep it seemed to hold all the oceans of the world. It was Elisa. She didn't move. She just stood there in my reflection, watching me from her glass prison. I was paralyzed, unable to look away. I didn't scream. The fear was so absolute it had surpassed my ability to react. My body was a statue of ice, but my mind was a whirlwind. I spun around. There was no one behind me. The room was empty, silent. I looked back at the mirror. She was still there, motionless, watching me with her desolate eyes. She was trapped, and she could only manifest there, in the object that had been her only confidant and her final jailer. And then the most terrifying part of all happened. She didn't attack me. She didn't lunge at me. She made no sound. She simply shared. I felt her sadness, not as an external emotion, but as if it were being poured into me. An icy wave of pure despair, of infinite loneliness, of yearning and resignation. I felt her 60 years of confinement, the slow erosion of her hope, the weight of every solitary dawn, every sleepless night. I felt the terror of watching one's own identity blur until it blended with the shadows of a room. The horror wasn't seeing her. The horror was feeling her. It was becoming her. My knees gave out and I fell to the floor. My body convulsed, not from a physical attack, but from the weight of a sorrow that wasn't mine but was consuming me. I gasped, not for lack of air, but from the anguish choking me from within. I looked at my hands, and for an instant they looked paler, thinner. I looked up at the mirror one last time. Elisa was still there, but her figure was now more translucent, and my own reflection. My reflection was changing. The terrified expression on my face was softening, melting away to make room for a mask of empty resignation. My eyes were losing their light, becoming as dark and deep as hers. I understood the final truth of the house. It wasn't haunted in the traditional sense, it was a sponge. It absorbed strong emotions, tragedies, and kept them alive, replaying them in an endless loop. My great-aunt had resisted for years, living with the echo of Elisa's sadness. But I had been foolish enough to open the door. Not just the door to the room, but the door to my own mind. I had actively sought the presence, and in finding it, I had offered it a new vessel. The cold was no longer coming from outside. It was emanating from my own chest. Elisa's sadness had settled into my soul, merging with mine. I stood up slowly, my movements no longer entirely my own. I walked toward the mirror. In the glass, Elisa's figure faded away completely. Now there was only my reflection, but it was no longer me. It was a man with empty eyes, his mouth set in a line of perpetual sorrow. I raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. It was cold, like my skin. I understood that I would never leave this room. The house had me. Elisa's echo had faded, and now mine was beginning. I stood there in front of the mirror as the storm subsided outside and a new silence, my silence, began to fill the house. Waiting. Not sure for what. Or maybe I was. Waiting for the day many years from now when someone desperate or foolish enough would once again turn the key in this door. The loft was a promise of brick and light. We had invested all our savings and part of our families to secure that space in the old Santa Brigida textile factory. The neighborhood was changing, gentrifying fast, and we had managed to get in just in time before prices became impossible. Lorena was thrilled. The space was huge, open, with very high ceilings supported by riveted iron beams and exposed brick walls that seemed to breathe history. The renovation had been clever, respecting the industrial structure but adding every modern comfort. An open stainless steel kitchen, a minimalist bathroom, polished micro-cement floors. The massive original windows flooded the loft with a cold but beautiful light during the day. It was our blank canvas, the place where we would finally begin our life together. The first days were a whirlwind of boxes, unassembled furniture, and that chaotic but happy energy of creating a home. We painted one wall a deep blue, hung our few pieces of art, and filled the place with our things. The contrast between the new and the old delighted us. The scars on the brick, the rust marks on the beams, were traces of an industrial past that now formed part of our modern aesthetic. We felt like pioneers, urban, a bit bohemian. But almost from the beginning, Lorena started noticing things. She had always been more sensitive to environments, more attuned to atmospheres than I was. I was too busy with the logistics of the move, with work, with the excitement of the project. But she began to talk about cold spots, specific points in the loft where the temperature inexplicably dropped several degrees. One near the large window overlooking the building's inner courtyard, another in the farthest corner of our improvised bedroom behind Japanese panels. At first, I blamed drafts, the poor insulation of the old structure. I told her we'd get rugs, check the window seals. Then she began hearing noises at night. I slept deeply, exhausted by the physical work of moving. But she woke up. She said she heard echoes, faint, almost imperceptible, like heavy machinery running far away. A dull, rhythmic thud that seemed to vibrate through the brick walls. I reminded her that the building was old, that sounds traveled strangely, probably the pipes or the freight elevators still used by the few workshops left on the lower floors. She nodded, but I could see doubt in her eyes. And there was the feeling of being watched. That was the vaguest, hardest to describe, yet the most disturbing thing. She said she felt eyes on her, especially when she was alone in the loft. A sense of multiple presences, silent, hostile. It didn't frighten her at first. It simply made her uneasy, as if she were trespassing in a space that didn't belong to her, even though it was legally hers. I tried to joke, told her maybe it was the ghosts of the old weavers checking if we treated their factory well, but my jokes didn't comfort her. My pragmatism began to crack when I started feeling the cold myself. It wasn't constant, but sometimes passing that spot by the window I felt a sudden chill, not of the air, but one that seemed to rise from inside the bones. It lasted only a second, then vanished. I kept blaming drafts, but the explanation began to sound hollow in my own head. The phenomena centered on Lorena, becoming more concrete. One afternoon, while I was working on my laptop at the large dining table we had improvised, she let out a muffled scream from the other end of the loft, near the entrance. I ran to her. She was pale, trembling, pointing toward the hallway. She said she had seen him. A man, very thin, almost skeletal, dressed in old, dirty work clothes, watching her from the stairwell. She said he had no eyes, only two dark hollows. And then he was gone. He had vanished into thin air. I hugged her, checked the stairs. No one. The door was locked. I told her she must be tired, the light playing tricks. But her terror was real. That night she barely slept, waking at every sound, clutching my arm. Then came the smells, phantom odors that I couldn't detect. Sometimes it was rancid industrial oil, a penetrating stench that made her wrinkle her nose. Other times, stagnant dampness, wet, rotten clothes. And the worst, a metallic scent like old blood and rust seeping from the brick in certain spots. I sniffed the air, searching for a source, checked for leaks, leftover chemicals from the renovation. Nothing. To me, the loft smelled only of paint and us. The weight on Lorena grew day by day. She moved through the apartment with constant tension, expecting something bad at any moment. She stopped enjoying the space. The high ceilings that once felt freeing now loomed oppressive. The brick walls she once found beautiful now seemed dirty, heavy with history. A history she felt as a physical presence. She began losing weight. Her eyes were ringed with dark circles. Our new life together, meant to start with excitement, was drowning in silent anxiety. I tried to stay calm, be the rational anchor, but I began to feel it too. I saw no figures, smelled no blood, but I felt the atmosphere, the heavy air, the unnatural silences that sometimes fell, as if the building itself were holding its breath. My irritability grew. We argued over trivial things. The tension between us deepened, fed by our different experiences. She lived in a haunted house. I lived with a frightened woman. The gap between our realities widened each day. That was when the mold appeared. It began in a corner of the upstairs bathroom far from the shower. A small black stain, barely visible. I cleaned it with bleach, scrubbing hard until the paint almost came off. The next morning it was back, larger. And it wasn't the usual greenish damp mold. It was thick, black, almost velvety, growing with unnatural speed. I tried stronger products. It vanished temporarily, but always returned, spreading up the wall like living ink. Then it showed up elsewhere. The corner of the bedroom, the kitchen pantry, always black, always aggressive. Along with the mold came small black insects. They emerged from the brick joints, from the vents. Not ordinary pests, they seemed born from the walls themselves. Silent, constant, a subtle infestation that added another layer of unease to our supposedly perfect home. One night we were watching a movie, trying to create a bubble of normality. Suddenly all the lights in the loft flickered violently and went out. We were plunged into darkness. Not a normal outage. The rest of the building stayed lit. We could see the neighbors' windows through the courtyard. Only our loft was dark. I checked the breaker box. All the switches were down. I flipped them back up. The lights returned. But as I did, I heard a sound. A clear, unmistakable sound that wasn't pipes or the elevator. It was the sound of looms. A rhythmic, mechanical clatter coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It lasted only seconds. Lorena had heard it too. We looked at each other in the dim hallway. Her face reflected my growing fear. I began researching the factory. What we had bought was a designer dream built atop an industrial nightmare. The Santa Brigida textile factory had been one of the city's largest in the early 20th century. But its history was stained with exploitation. I found old articles describing 14-hour workdays, miserable wages, constant accidents with heavy machinery. I read about strikes crushed by force, workers fired and left to starve, lung diseases from cotton dust, children working the looms. And I read about a fire in the 1930s that started in the dye section and spread quickly. The emergency exits were blocked. Over 50 workers died inside, burned alive or suffocated by toxic smoke. The factory never fully recovered. It closed for good in the 1970s, abandoned for decades, a hollow industrial skeleton in a forgotten neighborhood. Until the developers came, the gentrification, and our illusion of a modern loft. I understood what Lorena felt, what I had begun to feel. These weren't individual ghosts. It was the building itself, the collective echo of decades of suffering, of lives consumed by machinery and greed. A toxic memory soaked into the bricks, the beams, the air. A resentful presence, furious at being disturbed, wallpapered over with modern design and sold as a lifestyle. It hated our presence, hated our happiness, hated our light. And it was manifesting, breathing through cold walls, whispering with the echo of looms, watching through the hollow eyes of its victims. And it had chosen Lorena as its main conduit, the weak point through which to begin unraveling our reality. Understanding the factory's history didn't bring relief. It added a deeper, stickier layer of terror. These weren't random phenomena anymore. There was a dark logic behind them, the will of a place saturated with pain. Every cold spot, every mechanical echo, every phantom smell now carried a dreadful meaning. The loft stopped being our home and became the stage of a tragedy that refused to end. We were the unwilling actors invited to relive it. The feeling of being watched intensified now that I knew who or what was watching. They weren't invisible eyes anymore. They were the eyes of hundreds of trapped workers, dead from exhaustion, disease, or fire. Their lives had been crushed within those brick walls. Their resentment was tangible, a constant pressure in the air. I tried talking to Lorena about what I had discovered. I thought that sharing the horrible truth might unite us against it, give us a common enemy. But her reaction was strange. She listened to everything, the fire, the deaths, with an unsettling calm. No surprise, no fear. She simply nodded as if I were confirming something she already knew on a deeper level. She said in a flat voice that it made sense, that the building felt sad. Sad wasn't the word I would have used. Hostile, furious, malignant, yes. But she seemed to be tuning into a different frequency. Or maybe the entity was manipulating her in a subtler way. The phenomena continued, growing bolder. One morning, I heard Lorena scream my name from the bedroom. I ran. She was standing in front of the built-in closet, her eyes wide. The clothes she had folded were scattered on the floor, and among the crumpled garments were dozens of small objects, spools of thread. Old wooden bobbins, dusty, many empty. They weren't ours. Lorena swore that when she opened the closet, they shot out toward her, as if hurled from inside with force. Another day we were trying to eat. She had made something simple. While she was serving the plates, the smell came back, the metallic smell, old blood and rust. But this time it was overwhelming. It came from the food. The pasta looked normal but reeked like a slaughterhouse. Lorena dropped her fork, gagging. I pushed my plate away. The stench filled the loft for an hour. Then, as suddenly as it came, it vanished. The pasta smelled normal again, but neither of us could eat. The apparitions Lorena saw became more frequent. She started seeing fleeting figures inside the loft itself, shadows darting at the edge of her vision, reflections in the glass that didn't match anything real. Once, she said she saw a little girl sitting under the dining table, her face dirty, her dress torn. When she blinked, the girl was gone. Each vision left her paler, more drained. She refused to stay alone anymore. If I had to leave, she insisted on coming with me. My own resistance to believing was collapsing. I could no longer explain everything away as stress. The selective blackout, the phantom looms, the bobbins, the smell of blood. It was all too real. Fear settled in, a cold, constant fear. But mine was different from Lorena's. She felt harassed. I felt studied, as if the building was testing us, probing our limits. And I felt that the game was increasingly centered on her. The oppression became physical. Sometimes entering certain parts of the loft felt like walking through thickened air, like moving against invisible resistance. Breathing was difficult. My chest felt tight. Lorena described the same, only worse. She said she sometimes felt cold hands pressing on her shoulders, gently pushing her down. She said she heard her name whispered right behind her. I tried to find outside help, quietly. I called an electrician, pretending there were voltage fluctuations. He checked everything, said the wiring was new, perfect. I called pest control, mentioning strange insects. They sprayed chemicals. The insects disappeared for a day, then came back, unbothered, as if they belonged to the building. One night marked a turning point. We were in bed, half asleep. I heard a sound, different this time. Not the looms. A drip, slow, heavy, irregular. Coming from the corner of the bedroom, the same one where Lorena said she felt the coldest air. I got up quietly, turned on my phone flashlight and aimed it at the corner. The exposed brick wall was dark, damp, and from a joint between the bricks, a liquid was dripping. Thick, almost black. It wasn't water. It smelled of rust, old metal. I held my finger under it. The liquid was cold and oily, leaving a dark stain that wouldn't rub off. I shone the light upward, following the seam. Then I saw it. Wedged between two bricks was a metal object. It looked like a broken, rusted gear from some old machine. The black liquid was seeping from it. It was as if the building itself were crying tears of rotten oil. I backed away slowly. This wasn't a leak, it was a manifestation. The industrial past was literally bleeding through the walls. I went back to bed. I didn't tell Lorena. What could I say? The next morning, the stain had spread. The dripping was faster, and the piece of metal looked larger. Lorena saw it. She stared at the wall, pale as wax, said nothing, just turned and walked out of the bedroom. I found her in the kitchen making coffee with terrifying calm. Her apathy had returned, but this time it was different. It was resignation. That day the loft changed. The feeling of being watched vanished. The phantom smells disappeared. The cold spots normalized. Even the dripping stopped. The stain remained but didn't grow. There was an eerie silence, an unnatural calm. I felt relieved but uneasy. It was too sudden. Lorena, however, seemed renewed. She smiled again, said she felt better, that maybe it had all been stress. She cleaned the loft with new energy, even hummed while doing it. Her transformation was as abrupt as the disappearance of the phenomena. I couldn't relax. The calm felt like a trap. I moved through the loft cautiously, expecting the hostility to return. But it didn't. A day passed, then two, a week. The loft was normal again, quiet, peaceful. I began to think maybe Lorena was right. I was wrong. The entity hadn't left, it had simply changed tactics. The final attack wasn't against Lorena. It was against me. And it didn't come through apparitions or sounds. It came through the structure itself. It happened one night. Lorena slept deeply beside me. I couldn't. I went to the living room, sat on the couch in the dark, staring at the huge windows. The loft was silent. Then I heard a creak. From the iron beams in the ceiling, a dry metallic groan, then another, and another. The beams, those solid structures that had held the factory's weight for a century, were moving, twisting, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, then with visible force. The metal moaned under impossible tension. The ceiling above me began to warp. Plaster cracked, dust falling. I jumped to my feet. The beams weren't breaking, they were rearranging, shifting position. The space above me was changing shape. And then one of the main beams, the one spanning the center of the loft, began to descend. Slowly, inexorably. It wasn't falling, it was being lowered toward me. I ran for the bedroom. The beam dropped lower, blocking my way. I slipped through just in time, reached the door. It was shut. I tried to open it, stuck. I pounded it, called Lorena's name. No response. Behind me, the beam kept descending. And the walls, the brick walls of the living room, were moving, sliding inward, closing around me. The loft was turning into a press. The architecture itself had turned against me. The building wasn't just haunted. It was alive, and it was crushing me. Panic took over. I was trapped in the living room, and the room itself was shrinking. The brick walls slid inward with a low groan. The massive iron beam kept descending toward me. The air smelled of rust and crumbling mortar. I ran to the bedroom door, the one that was stuck. I slammed my fist against the wood, shouting Lorena's name. No answer from inside. Only the dense, apathetic silence that seemed to have taken hold of her. The beam was barely a yard above my head now. The side walls were so close I could almost touch both at once. The space was turning into a rectangular coffin. I hit the door again, this time with my shoulder. The wood cracked but didn't give way. It felt sealed from the inside. The beam dropped another few inches, the cold metal brushing my hair. I stumbled backward, tripping over one of the unpacked boxes. I fell hard. The floor beneath my palms vibrated, and I heard it again, the sound of looms. That mechanical, ghostly rattle, but now it came from below. I crawled toward the only possible direction, toward the open kitchen. The beam was descending over where the couch had been. The walls kept closing. The living room was becoming a narrow, crushing corridor. I reached the kitchen threshold. The space there looked normal, but the smell, the stench of industrial rot, was unbearable. And then I saw movement in the dim light. They were the thread spools, the ones that had appeared in the closet. Now they were in the kitchen, rolling across the polished concrete floor on their own. Dozens of them, rolling in slow circles, bumping softly into one another with dry wooden clicks. There was no slope. They simply moved, animated by some unseen will, weaving an invisible pattern at my feet. I backed away, stumbling over them. One struck my ankle. It was icy cold. I retreated toward the entrance of the loft, the front door. I knew it wouldn't lead to the stairwell, but maybe it had changed again. I grabbed the handle. It was hot. A dry, feverish heat. I turned it. The door opened. I was staring into a furnace, a huge industrial kiln made of fire brick, its dark mouth filled with cold ashes. The smell of burning, of charred fabric, filled my nose. I recognized the place from old photos, the factory's boiler room. I slammed the door shut. I was completely trapped. The loft was a living organism playing with me. A sound came from the bedroom. A click. The soft sound of a latch lifting. The bedroom door, the one I couldn't open, began to swing inward slowly. Lorena stood in the doorway. She was fully dressed, wearing her coat as if ready to go out. But her face was a mask of wax. Her eyes were open, fixed, staring through me. No emotion. No recognition. only a terrifying emptiness. "Lorena," I whispered. She didn't answer. She stepped into the narrowing living room. Behind her in the bedroom, I saw the back wall, the one that had once wept oil. It no longer dripped. It was completely covered by a pulsating black crust. And the piece of metal, the gear, had grown, now a jagged, toothed protrusion emerging from the wall. Lorena walked past me with slow, rigid steps, didn't even glance my way. She moved toward the kitchen, toward the rolling spools. She stopped in the middle of them and began to hum, the same off-key tune. The spools seemed to react, spinning faster around her. The iron beam above the living room stopped descending. It now hung just a yard above the floor. The walls froze too, leaving a claustrophobic corridor. The building seemed to hold its breath. All its attention was on Lorena. She raised her hand slowly. The kitchen's brick walls began to change. The exposed brick darkened, coated itself in soot and industrial grease. Damp stains appeared. The air filled with the acrid stench of dye chemicals. The loft was remembering, and Lorena was the catalyst. She turned toward me. Her face was still blank, but her lips moved, and I heard her voice, but layered with others. Faint echoes, the whispers of dead workers. "It's time to work," said that many-voiced murmur. "The loom cannot stop." She pointed toward the back of the kitchen. Where there had once been a wall, there was now an opening, a dark arch leading to a new space. Inside, in the shadows, I could barely make out the outlines of heavy machinery, looms. Lorena walked toward that opening. The spools rolled after her. She paused at the threshold and turned one last time. "Come," said the chorus of voices. "There's room for one more." Then she disappeared into the darkness of the loom room. I was alone. The loft was now an unrecognizable shell. The entity hadn't crushed me. It had saved me for last. It had shown me how it consumed Lorena, and now it was inviting me to join her. I could have stayed, waited for the walls to move again, but the image of Lorena vanishing into the dark pushed me forward. I had to try to bring her back. I moved through the crushed corridor of the living room. The iron beam hung overhead. I reached the kitchen. The spools were gone. The chemical smell was suffocating. I approached the dark arch, looked inside. The loom room was vast, far larger than the physical space should have allowed. It stretched into dusty half-light, row after row of silent, rusted machines. And at the far end, I saw a faint glow. I stepped inside. The air was heavy, motionless, the silence absolute. I walked between the dead looms, feeling tiny beneath the high ceilings. The floor was coated with thick layers of cotton dust and grime. I reached the source of the light. It was Lorena. She stood before one of the largest looms. Her hands moved over the broken, dusty threads as if weaving, and from her emanated a pale, sickly glow. "Lorena," I said. She turned. Her face was still blank, but the light pouring from her seemed stronger. She opened her mouth, and the chorus of voices came again, louder this time, echoing through the vast hall. "Welcome. The pattern is almost complete." I felt a presence behind me. I turned. Nothing. But the sensation of being watched was overwhelming. It came from everywhere. The entire building was looking at me. And I understood. Lorena wasn't the only one. The building was full of them. The echoes of dead workers trapped in an endless cycle of labor, and Lorena had joined them. The light from her body brightened. It blinded me for a moment. When my vision returned, she was no longer alone. Beside her, at neighboring looms, stood other figures, pale, translucent, wearing old work clothes. Men, women, children, all moving their hands over dead machines weaving air. Then the sound returned. The clatter, slow at first, then faster. The looms came alive. The shuttles moved on their own. The belts turned. The noise was deafening, an industrial roar that shook the floor. But they weren't weaving fabric. I looked at Lorena. The light inside her was fading. Her body grew thinner, more transparent. She was being consumed. The loom before her was weaving a tapestry made of shadow and pale light. And in its center, I saw an image forming. Lorena's face, her real face, but trapped within the fabric. Her eyes filled with endless sorrow. The building didn't just want to trap us, it wanted to weave us into its history of suffering. A sharp pain pierced my chest. I collapsed to my knees. The noise was unbearable. I looked at my hands. They were pale, almost translucent. Cold light began to seep from me too. I was starting to dissolve. The nearest loom came to life. It was calling me. I shut my eyes. I didn't want to become an echo. I gathered my last strength. I thought of Lorena, of the life we had dreamed of. And instead of fighting, I surrendered. But not to the machine. I surrendered to memory. I focused on the image of Lorena smiling on sunlight, on her laughter. I held on to that memory. The pain faded. The noise dimmed. I opened my eyes. I was floating, a warm spark of light in the vast darkness of the factory. Around me, the pale figures kept working. Lorena stood before her loom, her light almost gone, her face now woven into the tapestry of shadows. But I was different. My memory had anchored me to something beyond the building's suffering. I wasn't free. I was still trapped in the loft, in the factory, but I wasn't one of them. I was a witness, a small point of light, powerless, in a darkness that endlessly wove its own misery. I realized the true horror wasn't death. It was repetition. And this building, born from exploitation and sealed by fire, was condemned to repeat it forever. We were only the last spools of thread in its endless, rotting weave. The land stretched out before me like a scar. Barren fields, a grayish-brown color, were lost on the horizon under a leaden sky that threatened rain but never delivered. Nothing grew there. Not weeds, not moss, not the slightest green shoot. It was a landscape of absolute sterility, unnatural and profoundly unsettling. And in the center of that nothingness, like a sun-bleached bone, stood the farmhouse. It was my temporary home, my base of operations for the next few months. My name is Alan, and I'm a historian, specializing in the small, forgotten stories hidden in the margins of grand narratives, specifically agrarian microhistory and rural folklore. I had rented that isolated farmhouse for a very specific reason. I was researching the disappearance of the Fertile Furrow community, an agricultural group that had thrived in this valley for nearly 50 years in the late 19th century, only to vanish without a trace around 1910. There was no mass exodus, no records of disease or conflict. They simply ceased to exist one day. The census stopped counting them. Neighboring towns stopped trading with them. They evaporated. The only things left were these strangely sterile fields and the main farmhouse, abandoned but intact, as if its occupants had gone out to work the land and never returned. My goal was purely academic. I wanted to document the case, unravel the mystery, perhaps find some forgotten clue in the local archives or in the farmhouse's structure itself. It was the perfect material for my next book. The farmhouse was more isolated than I had imagined. The dirt road leading to it was barely visible, almost swallowed by the sparse, dry vegetation that died right where the barren fields began. There were no neighbors for miles. My only connection to the outside world was a weak cell signal that came and went at the wind's whim. The silence was total, oppressive. You couldn't hear birds or insects, only the sound of the wind sweeping across the empty fields with a constant dry whisper. The house was large, made of dark wood and stone, with a steep roof and small windows like suspicious eyes. It was worn by time but structurally sound. The inside smelled of dust, old wood, and something else, a faint Swedish odor almost like fermented hay that I couldn't place. It was furnished with the basics, Coarse and outdated furniture left behind by generations before the last known occupant, who had been the landlord, an old man in the nearest town who seemed eager to rent it at any price just to avoid setting foot on it again. I set up in what must have been the main living room, turning it into my makeshift study. I unpacked my books, my maps, my laptop. The electricity worked, though with an unstable voltage that made the bulbs flicker. There was running water, cold, and with a slight taste of dirt. I spent the first few days exploring the property and organizing my research. I walked the sterile fields. The earth was hard, compacted, almost petrified. I tried digging with a small shovel I found in the shed. I could barely scratch the surface. It was like trying to dig into cement. There were no worms, no roots, nothing, just this dead earth. The shed was full of old farming tools, rusted but strangely preserved. Pitchforks, hoes, scythes. They hung on the walls in an almost ceremonial order. I remember moving a pitchfork that was blocking the way to a dark corner. I leaned it against the opposite wall. The next day, when I went back to the shed for something, the pitchfork was back in its original spot, blocking the same corner. I chalked it up to a lapse in memory, to travel fatigue. I began to immerse myself in the few documents I had managed to acquire. Harvest records from the fertile furrow community. They were astonishing. They reported impossible yields, miracle crops year after year, even during times of drought or plagues that had devastated the neighboring counties. There was no logical explanation. The methods they described were traditional, almost primitive, but their results were supernatural. I also found fragments of personal diaries. They spoke of the pact, of the offering, of the hungry earth. Cryptic mentions, mixed in with notes about the weather and the price of grain. My academic mind searched for a rational explanation. Occult, perhaps syncretic pagan rituals. But the community's total disappearance remained an enigma. It was then I started hearing the sounds. They only happened at night when the silence was absolute. They were faint, almost imperceptible at first. A low, rhythmic murmur that seemed to come from far away, or perhaps from very close, from beneath the house. It sounded like a chant, a monotonous litany spoken by many voices at once, but with no discernible words. A sound that rose and fell in waves, and that would sometimes stop abruptly, leaving a silence even more tense than before. I would look out the window, but I only saw the impenetrable darkness of the barren fields. No lights, no movement. The sound seemed to well up from the earth itself. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer just a general unease. It was a certainty. I felt eyes on my back when I worked in my study. I felt a motionless presence in the doorway of my bedroom when I tried to sleep. And above all, I felt it when I walked the edge of the sterile fields. It was as if every clod of dead earth had a consciousness, and all of it was focused on me, the intruder. One evening, as the sun began to set, staining the leaden sky a sickly orange, I saw something. It was in the field closest to the house. A shadow. It wasn't the shadow of a cloud or an animal. It was tall and thin, vaguely human in shape, but distorted, elongated. It moved slowly between the empty furrows, as if inspecting the land. I stood motionless by the kitchen window, my heart pounding. The shadow stopped, and slowly, its upper end seemed to turn toward the house, toward me. It had no face. It was just a black silhouette against the dying light. But I felt its attention. It lasted only an instant. I blinked, and when I looked again, the shadow was gone. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, an optical illusion brought on by sunset and my own growing anxiety. But the encounter left me shaking. That night, the chanting was louder, clearer, and for the first time I thought I could make out words, or a single word repeated over and over. Hunger, hunger, hunger. The next morning, I found something on the front porch. It was a small bundle of dry hay tied with a coarse rope. It hadn't been there the night before. I opened it cautiously. Inside, there was nothing of value, just a handful of dirt. The same hard, grayish, sterile dirt from the fields. and mixed in with the dirt a lock of hair. Human hair, long and dark, and a tooth. A yellowed human molar with a broken root. I recoiled, feeling nauseous. This wasn't an illusion. It was a message. It was a warning. Or perhaps an invitation. I looked out at the silent fields. The land wasn't just dead. It was waiting. And I, with my academic curiosity, had come to awaken its appetite. I decided to double my precautions. I locked all the doors and windows at night, even though I knew it was useless if the threat came from the earth itself. I started sleeping with a lamp on. I tried to focus on my research, looking for answers in the old papers. I found a reference in one diary to the silent harvest. It didn't explain what it was, only that it was approaching, that the earth would claim its due, that silence was the price of abundance. The phrase chilled me. The community hadn't vanished. It had been harvested. That afternoon, while reviewing some old maps of the property, I noticed something strange on the most detailed one, hand-drawn by the community's founder. It showed the farmhouse, the fields, the nearby creek. But there was an area right in the center of the largest field marked with an odd symbol. A circle with 3 curved lines coming out of it like roots or tentacles, and a note in the margin, written in a shaky hand. Do not dig here. Ever. Curiosity, or perhaps a darker force, drove me. I grabbed the shovel from the shed, the same one I'd barely been able to scratch the surface with. I went to that field. The sun was high, but the air was cold. I found the approximate spot based on the map's boundaries. There was no visible mark on the ground, just the same grayish, sterile expanse. I began to dig. The earth was incredibly hard. Every shovelful required enormous effort. The metal shrieked against the petrified surface. I dug for almost an hour, sweating despite the cold, opening a small hole barely a foot deep. I was about to give up, thinking it was madness. Then the shovel hit something. It wasn't rock. It was something softer, yet resistant. I dug more carefully around it. It was wood. Dark wood, almost black, and strangely damp to the touch. It looked like the lid of a buried box or chest. I cleared the dirt from its surface. There was no lock, no visible hinges. It seemed sealed. I tried to pry it open with the shovel. The wood creaked, and then I heard the sound, the chant. Hunger, hunger, hunger. It wasn't coming from the ground. It was coming from the box. A low, vibrating murmur that I felt through the shovel, traveling up my arms. I dropped the tool and stumbled back. The chanting stopped. Silence fell over the field again. But now I knew I wasn't alone out there. There was something buried beneath my feet, something that was awake, and something that was hungry. I stumbled backward, away from the shallow hole and the dark wooden box that lay beneath. The echo of the chant, hunger, 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 resonated in my head, an internal vibration that didn't fade even after the audible sound had stopped. I left the shovel lying by the hole, a useless tool against this. I ran back to the farmhouse, not daring to look back, feeling the collective gaze of the sterile fields fixed on my back. I slammed the heavy wooden door of the house and threw the bolt, an instinctive but completely absurd gesture. What could a wooden door do to stop something that sang from beneath the earth? I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding painfully against my ribs. I tried to find a logical explanation. A subterranean pocket of air, a strange acoustic phenomenon caused by the wind passing over the buried box. My academic mind grasped at any rational possibility, however remote, but I knew I was lying to myself. The chant had been too clear, too intentional, and the lock of hair and the tooth on the porch, and the shadow in the field, and the tools that moved on their own. They weren't isolated incidents, they were part of a pattern that was closing in on me. The farmhouse felt different now. It was no longer just an old, isolated place. It felt complicit. The dark wooden walls seemed to absorb what little light came through the dirty windows. The smell of dust and fermented hay had intensified, and it now had a new nuance, a metallic sweetish odor, like dried blood mixed with dirt. I moved through the empty rooms, feeling more trapped than ever. Every creak of the floor, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I went to my makeshift study. I needed to work, to immerse myself in the documents, to find an answer in the past. But I couldn't concentrate. The words in the community's diaries seemed to stare back at me from the page. The hungry earth demands its payment. Silence is the promise. Abundance will be born from nothingness. Cryptic phrases that had once seemed like simple metaphors for the hard agricultural life now resonated with a terrifying literal meaning. The pact, the offering, the silent harvest. They weren't symbolic rituals. They were the description of a mechanism that had consumed an entire community and that now somehow I had reactivated. I decided to check the shed again. Maybe the tools would give me a clue. I left the house cautiously. The sky was still leaden, the air cold. I reached the shed. The door was closed. As I had left it, I went inside. The pitchfork that had moved was back in its original spot, blocking the dark corner. But something else had changed. The tools no longer hung inertly on the walls. They seemed tense. The patina of rust on a scythe looked redder, almost damp. And on the packed dirt floor there were marks, fresh drag marks, as if someone had been moving the heavy tools during the night. I approached the corner the pitchfork was blocking. I moved it aside carefully. Behind it in the gloom was a small pile of objects, old tattered clothing, similar to what the 19th century documents described. A child's pair of boots, worn and torn, and a book, a small book bound in dark leather, untitled. I picked it up. The leather was cold and strangely supple, like freshly tanned hide. I opened it. The pages were filled with a tight, nervous script. It wasn't a diary. It was a register of names and dates. And next to each name, a brief description: young, strong, willing, or sometimes weak, sickly, chosen. And at the end of each entry, the same phrase: given to the earth. Harvest secured. It was the ledger of the sacrifice. Page after page of names, of lives reduced to a macabre notation. I scanned the pages, feeling a cold horror. The last entry was from 1910. There was no name, just one sentence. All of them. The final offering. The silence is complete. I slammed the book shut. The community hadn't vanished. They had offered themselves en masse. A ritual collective suicide to placate the hungry earth one last time. Or maybe it wasn't voluntary. Maybe the earth, their hungry god, had simply taken them all. And their final sacrifice had sealed the pact, leaving the fields sterile, silent, until someone new arrived. Me. I left the shed, leaving the book there. I didn't want to bring that obscenity into the house. As I crossed the yard back to the farmhouse, I noticed something on the wooden wall of the house, near the back door. A growth, a fungus or lichen, a bluish-black color spreading from a crack in the wood. It hadn't been there this morning. It looked like grave mold, but it was growing with an unnatural speed, its edges visibly spreading as I watched. I touched the surface. It was cold and slightly rubbery, and it smelled like damp earth. The house wasn't just old, it was sick. It was being consumed by the same sterility that dominated the fields. That night, the chanting returned. Louder, more insistent. Hunger, hunger, hunger. It no longer seemed to come from under the house, but from everywhere. From the fields, from the air, from the walls themselves. I covered my ears, but the sound was internal, vibrating in my skull. And the nightmares began. I saw myself in the sterile fields digging, but I wasn't digging a hole. I was digging a furrow, an impossibly long and deep furrow. And as I dug, the earth around me came to life. Dark figures made of dirt and dry roots emerged from the fields and watched me in silence. They had vaguely human shapes, but their faces were empty sockets, and their hands were claws of dry branches. They didn't attack me. They just watched, waited, and I kept digging, unable to stop, feeling a terrible, unnatural joy in the labor, knowing I was preparing my own grave. I would wake up screaming, soaked in cold sweat, the sound of the chant ringing in my ears. I began to lose track of time. Days and nights blurred into a routine of fear and exhaustion. I barely ate. The water from the tap began to taste more strongly of earth, and sometimes it came out slightly cloudy with dark particles floating in it. I stopped trying to research. My only goal was to survive, to stay sane. But the loneliness and the constant chanting were eroding my mind. I started hearing whispers during the day, even when the chanting stopped. Voices that seemed to come on the wind or from the walls. They called me by name. They told me to come outside, that the earth was waiting for me, that silence was peace. I tried to leave. I packed a small backpack with what little food and bottled water I had left. I left the farmhouse at dawn. The dirt road I had arrived on snaked through the sterile fields. I started walking, my gaze fixed on the distant horizon where I knew the town, civilization had to be. I walked for hours. The landscape didn't change. The same brown and gray fields on both sides. The same leaden sky. The same silence, broken only by the wind. I didn't see the town. I didn't see any other road, any sign of life. I began to feel I was walking in circles, even though the path seemed straight. I pulled out my phone. Still no signal. The phone's compass just spun uselessly. I was lost. I stopped, exhausted, disoriented. I looked around. The farmhouse, it was there, just a few hundred yards away. I hadn't gotten anywhere at all. I had been walking for hours, but I was still in the same place. The road wasn't a road. It was a trap. The land itself was stopping me from leaving. I returned to the farmhouse, defeated. The door was open, though I had locked it. I went inside. The house was silent, but the smell had changed. It no longer smelled of rot or earth. It smelled of flowers. A sweet cloying smell like withered flowers at a funeral. I went to my study, and I froze in the doorway. The room had been transformed. My books, my papers, my computer, all gone. The walls were covered in dry, tangled roots. And in the center of the room, where my desk used to be, was a pedestal of packed earth. And on the pedestal was something new. It was a figure made of dry hay, branches, and dirt, roughly shaped like a human. It was wearing my clothes, the clothes I had left in my bedroom. And in the place where the head should be, there was a mass of dark roots. It had no face, but I knew it was watching me. It was a scarecrow, a substitute, my replacement, and then I heard the sound again. The chant, hunger, hunger, hunger. But this time it wasn't a murmur. It was a scream that came from the fields, a scream of expectation. The earth knew I had returned. It knew I couldn't escape, and now it was ready for the harvest. I ran out of the house aimlessly, just needing to get away from that grotesque figure. I ran into the sterile fields. The sky had suddenly darkened, as if a storm was about to break. The wind howled, kicking up clouds of gray dust. I ran between the empty furrows, and then I tripped. I fell face first onto the hard earth. When I looked up, I saw I hadn't tripped on a stone. I had tripped on a hand. A skeletal human hand, emerging from the earth, its bony fingers curled upward, as if asking for help. And around it, more began to emerge, dozens of hands, of arms, breaking the sterile surface. The dead of the fertile furrow community were waking up. Or rather, the earth was using them. They were rising from their anonymous graves, not as ghosts, but as puppets of bone and dirt. And they were all turning slowly toward me. The silent harvest was about to begin. Panic seized my throat. I was surrounded. The skeletal hands, desiccated by a century underground, emerged from the sterile furrows with an agonizing slowness. They weren't just hands. Bony arms, skulls with empty sockets filled with dry earth, arched ribs like broken cages. They broke the compacted surface with a dry, snapping sound. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, rising around me in a slowly closing circle. They made no sound, but their movements were coordinated, deliberate. They turned toward me, their empty sockets fixed in my direction, though they had no eyes to see. They were the puppets of the hungry earth, the remains of the last harvest summoned to prepare the next. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling backward. The chant. It returned with deafening force. Hunger, hunger, hunger. It was no longer a whisper in my head or a murmur underground. It was a thundering chorus that seemed to come from the dark sky, from the barren fields, from inside my own chest. Every pulse of the word shook the air, vibrated the ground beneath my feet. The wind howled with fury, raising a whirlwind of gray dust that stung my eyes and filled my mouth, tasting of ash and the grave. I ran. I ran without thinking, without direction, driven only by the most primal terror. The earthen skeletons moved slowly, but they were relentless. They pulled themselves fully upright, lurching figures of bone and dried clods, and began to walk toward me. Their steps were silent on the dead earth, but their advance was constant. They didn't run. They didn't need to. The field itself seemed to conspire against me. The ground beneath my feet became sticky as if trying to trap me. I stumbled constantly over unseen roots, fell to my knees on the hard surface. I glanced back. The circle of bony figures was following, closing in, their arms outstretched. The chant was a hammer pounding my skull. It forced me to keep running, but it also weakened me, stole my will. I ran toward the farmhouse. It was the only building, the only apparent shelter in this desolation. The front door was still open, a black rectangle in the dark facade. I reached the porch, stumbled up the rotting steps. I paused for an instant, gasping, and looked back at the fields. The skeletons had stopped at the edge of the farmhouse yard. They wouldn't cross. They just stood there, a silent, expectant crowd, their empty sockets fixed on me. I ran inside the house and slammed the door, throwing the rusted bolt. I knew it would do no good, but I needed the gesture. The house was plunged into near-total darkness. The smell of withered flowers had mixed again with the stench of earth and old blood. The chant was slightly duller in here, but still present, a constant vibration in the walls. I went to my study. The scarecrow was still there on its earthen pedestal, motionless. It seemed to have grown. Or maybe it was the darkness and my fear making it look larger, more threatening. Its arms of dry branches seemed outstretched as if waiting for an embrace. I couldn't stay there. The house wasn't a refuge. It was the center of the web. I had to go back outside. I had to face them. But how? I had no weapons, no escape. The chant was driving me mad, fragmenting my thoughts. Join. Silence. Hunger. Then I remembered the box, the dark wooden box buried in the center of the field. The spot marked on the map. Do not dig here. Ever. The chant seemed to come from there with more force. Maybe that was the key. Maybe if I destroyed the box, the chanting would stop. Maybe the dead would return to their rest. It was an irrational hope, born of desperation, but it was the only one I had left. I fumbled in the darkness of the house. I needed light. I needed the shovel. I found an old oil lamp in the kitchen, the kind the former inhabitants used. Miraculously, it still had some fuel. I lit it. The weak flickering flame cast dancing shadows on the diseased walls. I went out to the shed. The tools were still there, motionless. I grabbed the shovel. Its metal was ice cold to the touch. I stepped outside again. The skeletons were still there, surrounding the house, a macabre honor guard. They didn't move as I crossed the yard. They watched in silence as I headed back into the sterile fields. The chant hit me with renewed force as I left the illusory protection of the house. Hunger, hunger, hunger. It was an order, a plea, a promise. I walked toward the center of the field, guided by memory and the growing intensity of the chant. The oil lamp barely lit a few feet around me, creating a small, trembling circle of light in the vast darkness. I reached the hole I had dug. The dark wooden lid was still visible. I began to dig again with a desperate fury. The chant drove me, gave me strength. The earth seemed softer now, as if allowing me access. I uncovered the edges of the box. It was large, almost 6 feet long, like a coffin. It had no adornments, just that black, damp wood. I jammed the tip of the shovel into the seam between the lid and the body of the box. I pried with all my strength. The wood creaked. A crack opened. And from the crack came a smell, an indescribably foul stench of ancient decay, of corrupted earth, of something that should never have been unearthed. And the chanting stopped. The silence that fell was worse than the noise. It was an expectant silence charged with a terrible energy. I looked around. The skeletons at the edge of the yard were gone. The wind had stopped. The air was still, heavy. I pried again. The lid gave way with a dull snap and opened a few inches. I peered inside. The darkness was absolute, but it smelled of roots, of fertile earth, and of something else, something alive. Then from inside the box something emerged. It wasn't a hand or a creature, it was a root. A thick, black, gnarled root that moved with the slowness of a blind snake. It snaked out of the box and burrowed into the sterile dirt beside me, and where the root touched the dead earth, it seemed to spring to life. A small, dark green shoot instantly sprouted. Then another, and another. A circle of sick, black grass began to grow around the box. The root kept moving, exploring. It headed toward me. I stood paralyzed, hypnotized by the unnatural growth. The tip of the root brushed my boot. I felt an intense cold, a sharp pain that shot up my leg. I shouted and jumped back. The root stopped, and then slowly it retreated back into the box. The wooden lid slammed shut with a dull thud. The circle of black grass stopped growing. The silence continued. I understood my mistake. The box wasn't the source of the evil. It was the heart. It was the nexus of the pact. The thing sleeping inside wasn't a monster. It was the hungry earth itself, or a part of it. And I had awakened it completely. I turned to run, but I was too late. In front of me, blocking the path back to the farmhouse, was the scarecrow. It was no longer in the study. It was here, in the middle of the field. It had grown. It was enormous now, almost 10 feet tall. Its branch arms were long and ended in sharp claws, and in the massive roots that formed its head something glowed, 2 points of red, malignant light. It was watching me. And behind it, rising from the earth again, were the skeletons. But they were no longer just bone and dirt. They were covered in the same sick, black grass that had sprouted around the box. They were moving faster now, with a new, dark vitality. They surrounded me, closing the circle. The scarecrow raised an arm and pointed toward the buried box. And the chant returned, but it no longer said hunger. It said my name, Alan, Alan, Alan. It was a call, a sentence. The skeletons advanced. They didn't attack me, they seized me. Their bony hands, covered in rough roots, closed around my arms, my legs. They were incredibly strong. They lifted me off the ground. They began to carry me toward the box. I struggled, I screamed, but it was useless. There were too many. They dragged me over the hard earth. I saw the box open again. The darkness inside seemed to call to me. The smell of fertile earth and the grave was irresistible. They brought me to the edge. They held me over the dark void. I looked down. I saw nothing, only blackness. But I felt a presence in there, a vast, ancient, expectant presence. I felt it accept me, claim me. I closed my eyes. I waited for the end. Waited to feel the cold, damp earth close over me. Waited for the silence. But there was no silence. I heard my own scream, transformed into a guttural, inhuman sound, and then I felt the roots wrap around me, enter my skin, my flesh, my bones. I felt my body breaking down, becoming food. I felt my consciousness fragment, absorbed by the earth, joining the chorus of the dead. My last coherent thought was of the ledger. My name would be the next entry. Alan, historian, curious, chosen, and the final sentence. Given to the earth, harvest secured. There would be no more silence. I would be part of the chant, part of the hunger, forever. The silent harvest had claimed its new seed. I needed a cheap place and fast. My previous life had crumbled with the silent efficiency of a demolished building, and I was among the rubble, looking for a temporary refuge. I found it in a boarding house in the old part of the city, a tall, narrow building wedged between two others, with a facade that had seen better days. The manager, an older man with a soup-stained shirt and a tired gaze, showed me the room on the third floor. The air in the hallways smelled of floor wax, old dust, and the vague sadness of transient lives. The carpet runner that covered the hallway was so worn in the center that the wood underneath was visible, a dark path marked by thousands of anonymous comings and goings. The room was exactly what my budget allowed, simple, almost monastic. A bed, a small wardrobe, a chair, and a window that looked out onto an inner courtyard full of pipes and wires. The walls were covered with a cream-colored wallpaper, with a floral pattern so faded it was barely distinguishable. Everything was acceptable, nondescript, except for the stain. It occupied a considerable portion of the wall next to where the bed went, at the height where the pillow should be. It was a large, irregular stain, a reddish-brown color that darkened in the center and faded at the edges. It was a striking imperfection in the room's monotony. "And this?" I asked the manager, pointing to it. He glanced at it without interest. "Damp, I suppose," he said with a shrug. "Or maybe a previous tenant spilled wine. If you put the bed against the wall, you won't even notice it." He was right. I dragged the heavy iron bed, and the dark wooden headboard covered the stain completely. I left my suitcase, sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, and listened to the building's silence. It was a perfect place to go unnoticed, to be anonymous while I pieced my existence back together. I didn't know how wrong I was. The first night, exhaustion overcame me and I slept soundly. It was on the second night that it happened. I woke up suddenly, not knowing why. The room was in near total darkness, broken only by the faint orange glow of a distant streetlight seeping through the window. I looked at the clock on my phone, 3:15 in the morning. And then, in the absolute silence, the sounds began. First, it was the creak of a door opening somewhere nearby, probably in the adjoining room. Then footsteps. Two types of footsteps. One was heavy, slow, those of a large man, shuffling his feet slightly. The other was lighter, quicker, and hesitant, as if the person was doubting or resisting moving forward. Then voices. They weren't clear. They were muffled murmurs, as if coming through the wall. I couldn't distinguish the words, but the tones were unmistakable. One of the voices was deep, guttural, and angry. The other, higher-pitched, a whimper of fear and supplication. My body tensed under the sheets. A neighbor's fight, I thought. Nothing unusual in a place like this. I covered my head with the pillow, trying to ignore them. But then, the muffled argument escalated. The frightened murmur turned into a gasp, and suddenly a blow. It was a dull, wet thump, which resonated not only in my ears but in the entire structure of my bed. The sound seemed to come from the very wall my headboard was resting against. A heavy thump, followed by a sharp, choked gasp that was cut short. I felt the vibration of the impact through the mattress and the pillow, directly into my skull. I lay completely still, holding my breath. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. About 10 seconds passed. Then a new sound. A dragging noise. Slow, heavy. The unmistakable sound of a body being dragged across the wooden floor. The sound moved away from my wall, headed toward the door of the other room. And finally, I heard the same creak of the door closing, and then silence, an absolute, definitive silence. I stayed awake until dawn. Every muscle in my body seized up, waiting to hear a siren, a door opening, something. There was nothing. The next morning, with my heart still racing, I pressed my ear to the wall. I couldn't hear a thing. The room next door was as silent as a tomb. During the day, logic tried to reassert itself. It had been a very violent domestic dispute. Maybe they had just hit the wall with a fist. The dragging sound could have been a piece of furniture. I tried to convince myself, but the sequence, the clarity of the sounds, the wet thump, it had all been too real, too specific. That night I went to bed with a sense of dread. I stayed up reading with the light on, determined not to fall asleep. But tiredness was a powerful enemy. My eyelids began to grow heavy. I looked at the clock. 3:10. Just 5 more minutes, I told myself. I woke up again with a jolt. The light was still on. I looked at the clock. 3:15. And as if someone had flipped a switch, the sequence began again. The creak of the door, the footsteps, one heavy, one light. The murmurs, anger, and fear. The dull, wet thump against my wall, the vibration through my head, the choked gasp, the dragging, the door closing. It was identical, not similar, identical. Every sound, every pause, every nuance was an exact repetition of the night before. It wasn't a new fight. It was a recording. The following nights were torture. The event repeated without fail, always at 3:15 with the precision of a clock. I became a prisoner of that hour, my sleep fractured, my anxiety skyrocketing. I was forced to be the sole audience for a tragedy on loop. The terror was no longer that of violence, but that of the inevitable repetition. One night, fed up with passivity, I decided to do something. I placed my phone on the bedside table and activated the audio recorder. The next morning, I rewound the recording to the fateful hour and put on my headphones, turning the volume all the way up. It was all there. The footsteps, the murmurs, the thump. The recording was clear, crisp. I wasn't going crazy. The certainty that the sounds were real rather than reassuring me plunged me into a spiral of obsession. I spent my days listening to the recording over and over, trying to decipher the murmurs, searching for a key word, a clue. The rest of my life faded away. The reason I was in that boarding house, my plans for the future, all became irrelevant. My sole purpose was to understand the echo in that wall. The boarding house manager avoided me, probably taking me for a madman who never left his room. The other tenants were just shadows in the hallway. I was completely alone with my recording. I decided I had to see the stain. That afternoon, with considerable effort, I dragged the heavy bed away from the wall. The floral wallpaper in that section was darker and more discolored than the rest, and the stain was there, an ugly reddish-brown scar in the center. It was larger than I remembered, spreading out like a grotesque map. I touched it. It was dry, rough, ingrained in the paper. I left the bed pulled away from the wall. I wasn't going to sleep that night. I was going to watch. I sat in the chair on the other side of the room, flashlight in hand, and waited. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. At 3:10, my heart began to pound. At 3:15, right on time, the recording began. The door, the footsteps, the murmurs. The instant I heard the murmurs rise in tone, I switched on the flashlight and aimed the beam directly at the stain. And then, I saw it. And reality shattered. The stain changed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees at once. The faded reddish-brown color darkened. It became more vivid, brighter. It took on the hue and wet texture of fresh blood. I saw it glisten under my flashlight beam as if it had just been spilled. It didn't drip, but it looked fresh, liquid, as if the wound in the wall had opened anew. At the exact moment the dull thump sounded, a new, even more intense red spot bloomed in the center of the stain. And when the dragging sound began, a thin, dark line seemed to descend from the stain toward the floor, like a trickle of blood sliding down the wall. I held back a scream. I stayed there, paralyzed, illuminating that impossible manifestation, as the sound echo of the tragedy came to an end. When the phantom door closed, the stain began to fade. The bright red dimmed, returning to its dry, ancient tone. The dark, descending line vanished until, in less than a minute, the wall was the same as always. A wall with an old, ugly stain. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand. The stain had returned to its latent state, an inert scar on the wall, but the image of its transformation, of its horrific, bloody vitality, had been seared into my mind. I sat in the chair for the rest of the night, not daring to move, listening to the silence. But the silence was no longer empty. It was now filled with the memory of what I had witnessed. I had crossed a threshold. The phenomenon was no longer something happening in the next room. It was happening in mine. And the wall was not a barrier, but a canvas. Terror gave way to a feverish obsession. It was no longer about surviving the nights, but about understanding. Who was the victim? Who was the aggressor? The tragedy that replayed every night at 3:15 demanded a witness, and it had chosen me. For the next few days, my life was reduced to a single investigation. I went to the municipal library, a dusty building where time seemed to have stopped. I spent hours reviewing old newspaper archives on microfilm, searching for any mention of a violent event at the boarding house's address. The smell of old paper and dust filled my lungs as my eyes strained to read the faded headlines of past decades. I searched for missing persons reports, unsolved crimes, anything. I found nothing. The boarding house's history was a succession of anonymous owners and faceless tenants. The tragedy that had stained my wall had left no echo in the world, only in the wood and plaster itself. The failure of my investigation left me even more isolated. There was no one I could tell. Any attempt to explain what I had seen, the sounds, the living stain, would be met as the delirium of a sick mind. I was alone with my secret, in a conspiracy of silence between the house and me. And then the echo began to seep through. The nightly repetition was no longer content to be an audio-visual spectacle. It began to invade my other senses, to bleed into my waking hours. I started to smell things. A faint, sickening metallic odor like copper that would appear and disappear in the room for no apparent reason. Sometimes I would feel a sudden localized cold, a patch of icy air that brushed my skin as I passed the exact spot where the dragging sound ended. The sounds also began to decontextualize. Standing in the kitchen at noon, I would hear a single choked gasp, the same one that followed the thump on the wall, and then absolute silence. Or I would hear the creak of the door opening when I knew I was alone on the entire floor. The echo was breaking down, its fragments escaping the nightly loop to haunt me during the day, reminding me that the show never truly ended. The real torture began when the echo started to invade my own body. I started to feel emotions that were not mine. I could be reading a book completely calm, and suddenly, a wave of pure animal panic would flood me, leaving me with a racing heart and a cold sweat, only to vanish as quickly as it had come. Other times it was a sadness so deep and desolate it would double me over, a grief without a cause that left me empty and exhausted. I was feeling the victim, her fear, her despair. The point of no return was the physical pain. One night, as the performance began, I decided not to sit in the chair, but to lie in bed, my back to the wall as if trying to sleep. When the moment of the dull, wet thump arrived, I didn't just feel the vibration through the mattress. I felt a sharp, blinding pain in the back of my own head, as if I had been struck. I screamed, muffling the sound in the pillow. The pain was so real it left me dizzy and nauseous. I touched my head, expecting to feel blood, a wound, but there was nothing. The skin was intact. The pain lasted barely a second. The same second the sound of the impact lasted, and then it disappeared, leaving only a throbbing echo and the terror of knowing that the barrier between the recording and my body had been broken. From that night on, the ritual became physical torture. Every time the thump sounded, I felt the pain in my skull. When I heard the dragging sound, I felt a painful friction on my back and legs, as if my skin were being scraped against a splintered wooden floor. The residual echo was no longer satisfied with having an audience. It was turning me into the protagonist. It was forcing me to feel the victim's final moments night after night. I knew I had to flee. The boarding house was killing me, stripping me of my own identity to turn me into the vessel of someone else's tragedy. I packed my bag one morning, my hands trembling. I didn't care about the money or the lease. I just wanted out. But as I opened my room door, I froze. The hallway, which had always been in a quiet gloom, was completely dark, even though it was midday. and from the darkness came a murmur. The same angry murmur from the echo, but no longer muffled by a wall. It was there in the hallway waiting for me. I backed away and slammed the door shut. I was trapped. The echo was no longer confined to the room. It had taken over my reality. That night I knew I had only one option left. I couldn't run. I couldn't block it. I could only confront it. If it was forcing me to participate, then I would participate, but on my own terms. I left the bed against the wall. I didn't sit in the chair. I stood in the center of the room, the flashlight off, waiting in the darkness. I wanted the echo to find me there, standing, conscious. At 3:15, as always, the creak of the invisible door sounded behind me. Then the footsteps approaching. The furious murmur and the frightened whimper filled the room. I stood motionless, feeling the ghostly presences pass by me. The air swirled, cold and charged with a terrible energy. I waited for the moment of the blow. Just a second before it sounded, as the angry murmur reached its peak, I did something that wasn't in the script. I screamed with all the force of my lungs, a scream of rage, of fear, and of defiance. A real, living, and desperate sound in the midst of the ghostly performance. The instant my scream filled the room, all other sounds ceased. The echo fell silent. It was as if I had cut off a recording. An absolute silence, deeper than any other, fell over the room. And in that silence, I heard a new sound. A sigh. A single long sigh that seemed to exhale all the grief accumulated in that room for years. The air, previously icy, seemed to return to its normal temperature. I felt the pressure in my chest release, as if I had been holding my breath for weeks. I turned on the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the wall. The stain was gone. The wall was clean, covered by the same faded floral wallpaper, but without any scar. The echo had been broken. My sound, the sound of a living being refusing to be a mere spectator, had disintegrated it, or perhaps had set it free, finally giving it a voice other than that of its own repeated suffering. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting, but nothing else happened. The recording did not start again. The tragedy at last was over. The next morning I gathered my things. When I opened the door, the hallway was illuminated by sunlight. I walked out of the boarding house without looking back. The manager watched me go from his small office, but he said nothing. On his tired face, I thought I saw a shadow of relief. As I walked through the city streets, surrounded again by the noise and chaos of life, I felt an unexpected emptiness. The echo, with its terror and its repetition, had become the center of my existence. It had filled my own loneliness with the tragedy of another. And now, in its absence, the silence had returned. But it was a different silence. It was no longer a threat, but it wasn't peace either. It was simply absence. I understood then that some places hold the wounds of the past. They aren't ghosts seeking revenge, but scars in time that ache over and over. I didn't banish a spirit. I simply turned off an old recording with a new noise. I erased the last vestige of a forgotten person, her last terrible moment. Now the only one who remembered her was me. And in the stillness of my own nights, I sometimes think that silence is more terrifying than any ghost. Because in the silence you realize you are truly alone.